Story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
Tonight, what caused President Biden's surprising reversal on building a border wall in Texas? Then we're tracking Tropical Storm Philippe as it heads towards the New England coast. And meet the heroes brought in to save these soldiers without a voice on the CBS Evening News.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime. But the risks that come with it might make you look before you launch. Space tourism, tonight at 8 on the free CBS News app.
The most conservative candidate that can win, in my opinion, is Jim Jordan.
President Trump was upset that Speaker McCarthy poorly negotiated the debt limit deal and poorly negotiated the continuing resolution.
We're going to be able to say that we restored this country's sovereignty once and for all. You will have a border that matters. The border will be enforceable.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Donald Trump now says he'll do, quote, whatever is necessary to help select a new House Speaker. And some members of Congress say he's actually considering traveling to Capitol Hill next week. Two Republican lawmakers are vying for the position so far. Others might get in as they actively gauge whether they have support before they make that decision about jumping in. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise and House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan both announced their bids yesterday. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now. Scott, the race is on. Jordan versus Scalise. Who else might come in?
Kevin Hern of Oklahoma has expressed some interest in running and says he's been doing outreach to other members. But that's just the floor, not the ceiling. Ultimately, if somebody had a glide path to 217 or 218 votes right now, they'd be having votes right now. And there's a sense, Bob, I think a growing sense, that there are variables still to play out here. We know that the surrogates for Jim Jordan, including one of his surrogates from Ohio, is doing outreach to some of those New York Republicans today, trying to corral them into Jim Jordan's camp. Jim Jordan's camp has a sense there's a lot of work to be done to try to reach those Main Street or center-right Republicans. I talked to a surrogate for Steve Scalise, who said the same thing. There needs to be outreach done to capture some of those Main Street Republicans or center-right Republicans. So you can see where the battlefield is, right? This is where the votes are needed. This is where the votes are uncertain. But this is an early stage of a battle that almost guarantees twists and turns.
Scott, it's one thing to win the vote next week among the Republicans in private. They call that the conference vote, right? And there's another question about winning on the floor. Does anybody have the necessary votes right now to win on the floor? Who's closest in your estimation based on your reporting?
I think ultimately no one's close. And I think that's why there's a sense here, Bob, that not only could this go well beyond Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, this could get closer to that November 17th deadline for a government shutdown than some people expect. Not that it'll run right up on the deadline, but head in that direction. Now, there are reports, including from some members of Congress's social media feeds, that Donald Trump's considering to be part of this Tuesday candidates forum House Republicans are having. And I talked to one close ally of Steve Scalise who told me in a pretty muted phrase, yeah, I don't think that's going to be helpful. There are so many possible permutations that can complicate this race. But based on my sense of it, two things jump out, Bob. First of all, let's talk about the Republicans. Speaking to surrogates of Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise, both reaffirm that there's a major mystery box here. How do those suburban Philadelphia, New York City, and Los Angeles Republicans move on this? Because right now, none is declaring emphatic endorsements of either candidate. Democrats sent out a message to their members today, an email from Catherine Clark, the Democratic whip, that everybody needs to stay a walk away at maximum from the House floor next week. You got to stay in close proximity because every vote counts. They're keeping, Bob, a particularly meticulous nose count as next week begins.
And Scott, finally, in just about a minute here, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming wrote a scathing op-ed about outgoing House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Does she have any influence about how that McCarthy wing and the Trump allies are going to play their own cards in the coming days?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I'll also note, in addition to her criticisms of Kevin McCarthy, she had some pretty unbridled criticisms of Jim Jordan. saying that Jim Jordan would not be a suitable leader of the U.S. House for the future of democracy. You'll recall Jim Jordan was one of those members Republicans tried to appoint to the House Select January 6 committee, but was removed at the urging of Democratic leadership because they thought he was a relevant witness to some of what Donald Trump was planning and did January 6th. We'll see what influence Liz Cheney can have on some of these Republican members now, Bob, but she certainly does channel the voice of any number of Americans who have some concerns.
Scott McFarland, thank you very much. The Republican congressman who led the charge to oust Kevin McCarthy as House Speaker is now speaking out about that historic vote. Florida Republican Matt Gaetz is standing firm, not surprisingly, in his decision to file the motion to vacate. CBS News Miami investigative reporter Jim DeFede joins us now. Jim, always great to speak with you. And you spoke earlier today with Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida, who's at the center of everything that's going on Capitol Hill with his motion to vacate then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Let's listen to what Gaetz had to say to you about his efforts against the former speaker.
Did you have any last conversation with him?
Yeah, I informed the speaker that he needed to come into compliance with the agreement that he made in January, or he would face a motion to vacate. And his response was sort of a profane-laced tirade that wasn't particularly productive.
And do you think he's behind the ethics investigation of you? Do you think they're going to use that, weaponize that against you?
I do believe that Kevin McCarthy tried to signal to the ethics committee that if they turned up the heat on me, that would help him create leverage.
Jim, there's a lot there in the answer from Congressman Gaetz. Briefly, help us understand what exactly he's talking about. An ongoing ethics investigation about his conduct in Florida. What is he talking about, and why is he so frustrated with Kevin McCarthy?
So, as you may remember, Matt Gaetz was also under an FBI investigation for some time with allegations related to his relationship to a woman and whether or not she was under 18 at the time. No charges have ever been brought. As he says, as he told me, he's one of the most investigated members of Congress that there are. And so now, the ethics investigation, which had been on hold while the formal criminal investigation by DOJ took place, now that that's over, the ethics investigation has been renewed. And, he believes that there's been some signaling to the committee that basically they can use this as a way to kick him out of the conference and potentially kick him out of Congress if the Ethics Commission or the Ethics Committee comes back and finds against him in some way.
Does he have any evidence that he's shared publicly about that insinuation or suggestion?
No, he has not. He did not at least provide any to me.
But it does seem like this is deeply personal for Congressman Gaetz as he works against McCarthy and his allies.
Well, that's, and that was one of the questions that I asked him is that, Kevin McCarthy has made no secret of the fact that he says that he believes that Matt Gaetz's attack on him was entirely personal, that it didn't have to do with policy disputes, but rather was just an animus that he holds towards McCarthy. And so I asked, Matt Gaetz whether or not that was the case, and he denied it. He said it's purely about the policy differences between the two of them. Of course, there's some irony that he had to align with Democrats to get him out.
Speaking of that, whether it's personal or political or a little bit of both, to get McCarthy out of the speakership, Democrats did join with those Republican rebels who went against McCarthy. You spoke to Congressman Gaetz about that dynamic.
I wasn't working with Democrats. I actually expected them to vote against Kevin McCarthy for free, which it turns out they did. But the yellow brick road of working with Democrats was actually designed, constructed, and paved by Kevin McCarthy.
It's one of the more interesting aspects of it because one of the criticisms that Gaetz has had of McCarthy during the process, particularly the continuing resolution, was that McCarthy needed to turn to Democrats who voted in large numbers for the continuing resolution to keep the government open, whereas a majority of Republicans did not support that measure. So that was one of his criticisms, was that McCarthy had basically aligned with Democrats. Well, the 8 Republicans, Gaetz and the 7 compatriots of his, had to align with 208 Democrats in order to remove McCarthy as Speaker. I asked him if he found that ironic. He said no. He says he basically never negotiated with Democrats. They just came along for free.
Another figure who's hovering over this entire process is former President Donald Trump, who has worked closely with McCarthy over the years. In fact, Kevin McCarthy once gave then President Trump a whole jar of Starburst candy because he knew Trump liked them so much, and it was a reflection of how cozy they had become as political allies. Gaetz, of course, also a close ally of former President Donald Trump. Let's listen to what Gaetz had to tell you about whether Trump weighed in on his decision to go against McCarthy.
Since you talk to him every day, did you consult with him in advance of making the move to oust the speaker? Did he sign off on that? Did he give you his blessing?
I think his exact words, Jim, were "do what you have to do," and that was enough of a blessing for me.
So you see in Gaetz a little bit of a coy answer, a bit of a wink. What role, based on your reporting, do you believe Trump played behind the scenes, Jim?
You know, that is why I wanted to ask the question, in part because, you know, other than I think one post on Truth Social where he talked about how, you know, rather than fighting amongst themselves, they should be focused on the Democrats and the Biden administration. We haven't heard from the former president very much. He's been tied up, obviously, in the New York case that he's dealing with. And so this was at least the beginning of trying to pierce that veil and try to get inside some of those conversations. The fact that this took place just before the vote, the fact that Gaetz did reach out to Trump and tell him that this is what he planned, and you heard what Gaetz claimed the former president said, you know, it's an interesting sort of look. I'm sure we'll hear more from Donald Trump eventually about it. One of the things that Gaetz also told me was that he intends to be on the campaign trail alongside President Trump next week, of course, depending on the vote for speaker next week. But he's planning on being right along Trump's side, and Trump will see if he'll have him with him.
And we know you'll be on top of all of those things, Jim, as you are nationally and in Florida. Really appreciate you being with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
The Biden administration is allowing more border wall construction despite opposition from some Democrats. Next, we discuss the president's position and the potential political ramifications. You're streaming America Decides.
Well, let me start with this.
This really
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you learned?
Do you know why?
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 It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're going to call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish that you and I are going to have.
Yep.
Oh, really good.
Is it good?
Mm-hmm.
Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
If we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
hunger? Yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS Reports.
You had a substitute teacher that was pretty popular. What was his reputation?
Everyone loved him.
You had to miss a test. What did he offer to have you make up the test?
He said that I can come by after school was all over and just take the exam. The blinds were down. He closed the door. The next thing I knew, he was right next to me. That's when I realized what was going to happen. Even if I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, no one would hear me because no one was there. He told me that if I ever said anything to anyone, he would kill me and he would kill my family. So I did it.
Pledge of Silence, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
He was there when the war in Ukraine started.
Extreme history. It's a big moment.
The extraordinary story behind Sean Penn's new Paramount Plus documentary, Superpower, when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discovery, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable.
The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Why did you miss the moment?
I'm not sure why they missed the moment.
It doesn't look like Congress is doing anything. That's the role of Face the Nation, to focus on the issues at hand. That means a civil conversation with perspective.
Border wall, the money was appropriated for the border wall. I tried to get them to reappropriate, to redirect that money. They didn't, they wouldn't. And in the meantime, there's nothing under the law other than they have to use the money for what it was appropriated. I can't stop that.
Do you believe the border wall works?
No.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was President Biden defending his administration's plan to waive several environmental laws to add to the U.S.-Mexico border wall. That's something the president promised would not happen. Former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke, he calls it, quote, a wasted opportunity to use executive power to actually fix our asylum system instead of impotent political posturing. Chuck Rocha and Daniel Garza join us now. Chuck is a Democratic strategist and president of the Solidarity Strategies Group. He previously served as a senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont in his 2020 presidential campaign. Daniel is the president of the conservative grassroots organization, the Libre Initiative. Good to have you both here. Thank you. Chuck, we'll begin with you. There's been criticism of President Biden's decision. You have worked on this front for a long time. What's your assessment of it?
You know, the community came together today and we were talking about this, and I think I'm really happy that the president got out in front of this and said, look, this is a legislative activity. The money had already been appropriated. Do I agree with the decision? No, but there was nothing he could do to stop it.
Let's listen to what Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, had to say.
We believe that we need border technology that is modernized and land ports of land ports of entry, and that's what we want to see. And that's what I can speak to. And this is something that we were required by law, and we are complying. This is an administration that does believe in the rule of law.
This is an administration that believes in the rule of law. That was from Karine Jean-Pierre from the Biden administration. Daniel, where are Republicans on this and conservatives as they see the president moving in this direction?
Well, look, I mean, you're seeing the Biden administration seemingly declare an about face on the border wall. But today, they're saying that, of course, it's not necessarily the case that they are pushing for a border wall. And it's almost like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, and the incoherence is dizzying. They're trying to appease two competing factions in their party. The blue city mayors and some governors who, of course, have been very vocal. Republicans are seeing that, of course, and they've been, of course, driving the argument that we need border security. But they're playing a clever game here of duplicity and sophistry that will, I think, only end bad. Whatever it is, they're kind of late to the party. This has been sort of essentially turned into a half measure. I mean, what's the point of securing the border with a wall if Biden is allowing migrants to game the asylum system by, migrants can merely claim that they're, seeking asylum, whether they qualify or not, and then they're flown to their city of choice and given resources. It's just the crisis is worsening, and they don't know what to do. They're incompetent.
Chuck, what's your view of what Daniel had to say?
Well, first of all, we should know that the immigration system can be fixed in the Congress, and they do nothing. And they're in control. They should be fixing the problem. It highlights all the things that are going wrong. There's not just one thing wrong at the border. There's lots of things been happening with the border. As you know, Rob, we've been talking about this and covering this for a long time. I own a Latino-owned political consulting firm. I've hired over 125 young Latinos over the last 10 years who work in these nonprofit fields, and nothing ever seems to happen around this broken system. So it keeps adding on to each other. And then you start seeing when there's surges or when there's something that's happening with the environment, and then you see this thing that we're not prepared to handle all at one time. So is it a wall? Is it technology? I think the home congressman who represents this part of the country said it best today when he said we're using a 14th century fix to try to fix a 21st century problem.
Let's go back in time a little bit and listen to what then candidate Biden had to say about this issue during the 2020 campaign.
There will not be another
foot of wall constructed on my administration. I'm going to make sure that we have border protection, but it's going to be based on making sure that we use high-tech capacity to deal with it.
So that was then candidate Biden running for president in 2020. Daniel, how is this issue going to factor into the next campaign in 2024?
Oh, very much so. Look, I agree with Chuck when he talks about, Congress has to step up. They have the responsibility of dealing with this issue, and they have, pushed on it. The solution was to work with Republicans to reform also the asylum system, to build out infrastructure, increase the number of judges and caseworkers, while still, of course, honoring due process here. People need to know immediately whether they qualify and not be allowed into the country willy-nilly. The Border Solutions Act would have done that. This administration, during the campaign, candidate Biden had promised that he was going to reach across the aisle and work with Republicans to reconcile their differences between legal channels and border security. Never did that, never convened anybody to the White House, and we're still waiting. Look, I think there is a role for a wall. The wall does have an important and urgent purpose. In 2019, there were 0 encounters with suspected terrorists. This year alone, there's been 151. The wall would have helps with that. And then, of course, there's certain cartel activity that operates outside of the asylum process. Of course, human trafficking, narcotics, weapons contraband, and other nefarious businesses. The wall would help with that. So there are other policies that we can do besides the wall, like Chuck says. I agree with that. That is going to factor in big time in this next election because, look, I know they've been bleeding. The Democrats have been bleeding Latino voters in South Texas because of this issue. And it can no longer be ignored, and I think that's why he's stressing this action.
Chuck works with so many Democratic voters from the Latino community. Is Daniel right? Is President Biden, Democrats, will they pay a cost politically for this decision?
The election's coming up, and that's what you're going to see a lot of talk about immigration. But it's different when you're talking about these Midwestern states or battleground states for the president as compared to Nevada and Arizona. Texas won't be a presidential battleground state in this election cycle, but the issue of immigration that Daniel brings up is very, very important to lots of different voters in different areas. We find where our voters interact with immigrants, they have they're more comfortable with it. But when you're talking about the Midwest, they're not as near as comfortable.
Chuck Rocha and Daniel Garza, thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us for a conversation.
A pleasure.
Millions of girls my age and long after me have grown blissfully free of the yokes our grandmothers wore because Diane Feinstein wrestled them off, because she showed the way. She created a world where girls like me could be tough, where we could lead.
That was San Francisco Mayor London Breed paying tribute to Diane Feinstein at the longtime late senator's funeral service. Mourners gathered outside San Francisco City Hall. Vice President Kamala Harris spoke and called Feinstein an American patriot
Millions
and
of
a
girls
giant
my
of the
age
Senate.
and long after me have grown blissfully free.
Simply put, she was a force. Diane commanded respect, and she gave respect. She was a serious and gracious person who welcomed debate and discussion, but always required that it would be well-informed and studied.
Feinstein launched her political career in San Francisco, where she spent almost a decade as the city's first female mayor. She would again make history in 1992 when she became California's first female senator. Florida Governor Ron DanSantis is on the campaign trail in Tampa, Florida. We'll discuss the latest announcements from the governor's team. You're streaming America Decides.
When weather turns extreme, CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real, you'll have time to get prepared. Feel the forecast. Weather when it matters most on CBS Mornings.
An original documentary from CBS reports
that Desired Farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
promises broke in.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Politics isn't a game. Why aren't you holding yourself to that standard? Politics is about policy. Was this the right way to actually get this done? I'm a voracious consumer of information, and I'm impatient. I don't like to be spun. To be moderator of Face the Nation is not an anchor, it's not an actress. You are up here to moderate a conversation. That means bringing the most powerful stakeholders to the table to become better informed.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education.
Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
She is a beloved American icon and head of a media empire. But is Oprah Winfrey happy? How do you define happiness?
Yeah, I call it happierness.
Find out when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It was genocide, a deliberate effort by the United States government to eliminate the food source that was relied upon by Native American tribes.
American bison were slaughtered and Native Americans displaced.
And that's how tribes were subjugated to reservations and our lands were taken.
But now, through conservation efforts at Yellowstone,
Buffalo provided everything that we needed. Now they need help.
a herd grows.
We need to step up and help them.
And a culture is reborn.
When the buffalo return and come back, that's when our tribe will begin to heal.
Yellowstone Bison Revival, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Welcome back to America Decides. Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is on the campaign trail in his home state of Florida. In a news conference this afternoon, he touted new endorsements from over 60 Florida law enforcement officers and touched on a number of policy issues. CBS News political reporter Aaron Navarro joins us now from Tampa. Aaron, thanks for being here. You're there on the ground covering the campaign. Florida Governor DeSantis clearly trying to come back in this race, catch up with former President Donald Trump. Focusing on law enforcement today, what's the significance of that, and where do you see his campaign going based on your reporting?
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me. What was notable to me today and yesterday when he was campaigning in South Carolina is DeSantis perhaps, acknowledging the gap that exists in the polls, went after Trump on the stuff. Now, in interviews on the debate stage, you'll hear DeSantis say that Trump failed on his promises on the border. But I've noticed lately that he is incorporating it into his speech directly to voters, saying that Trump didn't follow through with getting Mexico to pay for the border wall. And when a reporter asked about the fundraising gap between himself and Trump in terms of cash on hand, he had some pretty pointed comments for his main primary rival. Take a listen.
Well, why is he raising that money, and where's that money going to? Isn't it going to a lot of lawyers? Seriously, like that, I get that, and I get he had a lot of boost on some of those things. But if you look at total, all the different committees, we're still ahead of everybody when you count the other PACs and everything, and we're going to continue to be very strong.
Now, DeSantis has gone after Trump, acknowledging that he lost Georgia and Pennsylvania. Maybe not a big deal, but a departure from what DeSantis was saying maybe a couple months or a year ago, signaling DeSantis, knowing where he is right now in this primary race, is starting to take the gloves off in terms of going after Trump.
Aaron, the governor's third quarter fundraising numbers have recently been released. How is the DeSantis campaign doing, and what are donors saying to you behind the scenes?
So a total of $15 million raised from July through September. And the DeSantis campaign is saying that they're pleased with this number. They're saying that they're in a better spot financially than when they ended the last quarter. Remember, after that quarter ended and went through June, in July, we saw them cut staff. We saw them shake up the campaign brass. Now they're moving campaign staff to Iowa. Donors I've been talking to have been more mixed. Most of them have been saying that they're pleased with the number, that they saw some momentum, especially after the debate performances. But a couple of them pointed to the cash on hand. He had $15 million cash on hand, but only $5 million of that can be used for the primary. And one just texted back saying, not impressed.
Aaron, you've been covering the DeSantis campaign for so long. In about just 45 seconds here to close us up, what are you watching right now? What really matters for DeSantis and his people as this thing heats up and the primaries and caucuses loom?
It's no secret DeSantis has kind of put all his chips into Iowa. What I'm going to be watching is that going to really negatively impact him in New Hampshire and South Carolina? We've seen a couple polls where Nikki Haley is ahead of DeSantis in New Hampshire, and DeSantis really hasn't been there for a while. Is the focus on Iowa and diverting attention away from these other states, is that going to hurt him? You know, well, even if he does do well in Iowa, once he gets into those other states, if he has a poor performance, how will that impact his path to the nomination?
It's a great point. Senator Ted Cruz won Iowa in 2016, didn't win the nomination. Aaron Navarro, thank you so much for your reporting. And we want to quickly welcome the newest additions to the CBS News political unit, our 2024 campaign reporters. You see Aaron Navarro right there in the middle, continuing his reporting role for the network. These dedicated reporters are hitting the campaign trail and will be reporting for us throughout the country until Election Day next year. You'll be frequently seeing their reporting right here on America Decides. That does it for our show today. You can stream us any day, Monday to Thursday, at least 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.
On Face the Nation, the way to learn is to listen.
We may have a recession.
Listening to how someone explains themselves is so key.